My name is Mustafa Ahmed. I'm the leader for diversity services with the ethics and diversity team here at Fraser Health. Before we dive into the discussions, I would like to start by acknowledging that we are conducting our business today on the unceded and traditional shared territories of the Katsi, Simeamu, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, and Swasan First Nations. Thank you for joining us for this webinar once again, and for your trust as you journey through these challenging discussions with us. Racism towards the Black community has recently been receiving much attention in social media, in the news, and in conversation with our friends and loved ones. It has been more than 100 days since people took to the streets to support Black Lives Matter and the related social justice movement. These protests brought into focus long-standing brutality in policing and systemic racism in institutions of all levels of society, including healthcare. We understand that systemic racism exists in our country's social structures, and as a result, are committed to raising awareness, listening to the lived experiences of those who encounter it, and providing tools to combat in our healthcare system. It's often thought that anti-Black racism is something that's rampant in our neighbors to the south. However, Canada's legacy of perpetuating anti-Black racism includes, and is not limited to, the practicing of slavery for over 206 years, with the last segregated school closing in 1983. The belief in a scientific hierarchy between races, which began in the Enlightenment era to justify colonial expansion, has unfortunately been consciously and unconsciously ingrained in the minds of many. This historic precedent is evident in the mistreatment of Black people in healthcare and the continued subjugation of Canada's Indigenous people. The goal of these discussions is to build our understanding for how we can collectively change unjust systems in our societies that arbitrarily discriminate against racialized groups and individuals. At the end of the webinar, you will have the option to complete a survey, and we would ask if you could please fill it out as we take your feedback seriously. I will mention this again at the end of the webinar. For today's sessions, I am excited and very eager to have these conversations with Professor Handel Wright. Professor Handel Wright is currently a full professor and director for the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education at the University of British Columbia. Professor Wright has published extensively on continental African cultural studies of education, critical multiculturalism, and anti-racist education, among many other things. We also have joining us from Ontario, Aika Washington. Aika is a recent master's graduate in social sciences, specializing in gerontology from the University of Southampton in the UK, and a solid biology background from Western University in Ontario. Aika has been working to shape new conversations about minority healthcare through her work in sickle cell disease, guided by her mission to advocate for health promotion and improvement of health policies and support of patients and their families and increasing health equity for vulnerable populations. Currently, Aika is also the founder of Diversity Talk, a platform to engage and educate the public about minority health and alternative treatment through cultural competent education, events, and policy research. Thank you, Aika. Last but not least is our own Ivy Williams. Ivy is the clinical practice leader for MHSU, Mental Health and Substance Use Social Work with Fraser Health. An extensive background in healthcare, a vocal advocate for diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice in patient and provider experiences. Thank you all for joining us. You will see a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Please send in your questions as we have time in the second half of the webinar to discuss. Now, Professor Handel, we have today our title as Anti-Blackness. We also have Imperfect Allyship and being anti-racist. I was wondering if you can help us a little bit deconstruct, what does anti-Blackness mean? What is an imperfect allyship? And what does it mean to be anti-racist?
So greetings from what is presently called Richmond, BC, which is part of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of some of the Coast-Salish peoples, in particular the Kwantlen, the Tawasan, and especially the Musqueam. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this really important series of discussions addressing the perennial problem of racism and anti-racism. You've given us the title Anti-Blackness, Imperfect Allyship, and Being Anti-Racist. And you're asking me to say a little bit about each of them. Well, I want to start with anti-Blackness and talk about it as a very specific form of racism, because there are different ways in which racism plays out in how it's directed at different IBPOC groups. So I would want to define anti-Black racism as the kind of confluence of societal negative stereotypes, institutional systemic barriers and policies, and even everyday individual practices that are discriminatory against Black people. And I try to use the acronym DEF, D-E-F, when I talk about this. That is denial, erasure, and forgetting. So in terms of denial, we can look at historical racism against Black people. You yourself have mentioned slavery in Canada and how that's not emphasized in education. And we also have denial by comparison. So people usually say, well, things are not as bad as they are in the US. We love that US comparison. So if it's not as bad, we're almost getting to the point where we're saying maybe it doesn't exist. So there's the denial of anti-Black racism. That's a real problem. Then there's a problem of erasure. And by this, I mean sometimes literal erasure. So from history, I go to geography and historical geography. The erasure of what was Hogan's Alley, where there was a concentration of Black people. So that was Black Strathcona. So literally, the result is that there is no Black space, unlike other major cities in Canada. So without Black ethnoburbs, we can think there really is no Black presence. And finally, forgetting. We seem to have a convenient amnesia in Canada about the history of Blacks, even in BC. So that Black people, for example, were some of the first settlers, as problematic as that can be, of Salt Spring Island, that there were the African rifles in Victoria, that Hogan's Alley was erased. So we seem to win, there's a history that we somehow seem to forget, and we think of Black people as only recently arrived, only recent immigrants from Africa or refugees from Africa constitute Black people. And then I'll jump on to imperfect allyship. And I think I really like the term that you use, imperfect allyship, because I think it's impossible to get perfect allyship. So I want to give a quick definition and say, from my perspective, an ally is a person who actively and in a respectful and sustained manner engages in the struggle of a group that is marginalized or discriminated against, even though they themselves are not part of that group. And there are lots of bad ways of being an ally. There's performance allyship, there's short-term allyship, there's leadership allyship, there's spokesperson allyship, all of which are bad. So I don't want to go into those too much. But I do want to say that to be a good ally, one must start from the premise, this is beyond denial of racism, beyond the idea of not being racist. So it's about being actively involved. That's what it means to be an ally. And it means, as I said in my definition, to be involved in a sustained manner, which means you engage, and it's not a fly-by-night kind of thing, or it's not the latest thing, which I think for some people, some of the recent activism might be about. And it also requires a kind of humility that you don't know and you haven't walked in the shoes of those who are going through this. So you ought not to become sort of like the spokesperson. You're always learning as an ally. And an allyship should be a thing of mutuality. If people are allied to you, you ought to be thinking about how you and members of your group can be allies to others. Because the ultimate goal is not allyship in and of itself, but a better a better community, a better institution, a better society. Those are the ultimate goals. So then I want to finally just say something about what it means then to be anti-racist. And I want to say that we're talking about people and we're also talking about institutions, but I would emphasize the link between the two. So we talk about systemic racism as being institutional, but we ought to realize also that there are individuals involved in those institutions. So we ought to see the link between individual racism and individual anti-racism and institutional racism and institutional ways of addressing racism. And we ought to talk about being anti-racist as being a commitment and involvement at all levels, from administration to workers. So everybody ought to be involved. And I think when people take on anti-racist struggles, sometimes they're either looking inwards or they're looking outwards. Very often, more often than not, they're looking outwards. Academics, for example, we can find all kinds of problems out in community, but we don't look within the institution itself. So being anti-racist means looking both inwards and outwards for anti-racist interventions. Not only the ways in which, for example, in the field of healthcare, you deal with patients and their families and the publics, which is the outward looking, but equally importantly, right, the way in which the institution and those with power in the institution especially are dealing with colleagues, with supervisors, and with supervisees. So I want to stop there as a kind of introduction to how I would break down those three things that you gave us, which I think were so important as a way of introducing things.
Thank you, Handel. I appreciate the acronym for DAFE. It makes the understanding of the intersections from the denial to the erasure to the forgetfulness, and it's present in how we're showing up today in our current protest and the understanding of racism in general, and your connection to the history. I'm wondering, Aika, extreme anti-Black racism is also perpetuated by racialized people. This is not who have been colonized. This quickly dispels sort of this notion of the myth that anti-Black racism is specific to white people only.
Yeah.
In communities,
sorry, go ahead.
In communities where the population is diverse, as Canada, oftentimes Black people experience racism at the hands of people of color, especially in settings such as healthcare, where a majority of frontline workers tend to be visible minorities themselves. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great conversation. And I think that's what anti-Black racism is when you're talking about that, is that it's not just primarily with white counterparts, it's also within other racialized groups. This idea where you're prejudiced towards Black individuals. And that's present through shadeism, which is also colorism. It's also prevalent through in which we understand. I know there's certain cultures in specific that have names for Black people that are very prejudiced and very stereotypical, or this is stereotypes and stigmatization towards these Black people. So I think there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation in terms of the ways in which we understand Black populations and Black people, and that we're not just a homogeneous group of people, that within our groups of people, we have different ways in which, in terms of culture and ethnicity. So it's very important not to just group everyone when it comes to Blacks. And that is something that a lot of visual minorities do tend to do, which I've experienced personally. And it's a matter of education. And in the same token, it's a matter of all of us being educated about each other and being aware that we're very different from each other, but at the same time, we need to take accountability in terms of the ways in which we perceive these groups of people.
Great, thank you, Aika. Ivy, as a leader in healthcare for a long time and working in a specific area like mental health, where there's a lot of vulnerability. I'm wondering, what do you say to people who dismiss the health disparities and toxic effects of stress due to racism by blaming genetics, culture, other explanations often inherent to, say, Black population? For example, Blacks get heart disease because they eat too much fried food. Like, these stereotypes, what do we see? Ivy, you are on mute. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Okay.
You're good now.
Sorry. Well, thank you, Matassa. Just in response to that, I would also maybe expand a little bit on what Dr. Andel was saying with regards to that denial piece. In healthcare, we know that the impact of the historical trauma that people experience in over the years, but also the current issues that people deal with, does play in the, on the health of individuals. So in saying that, this is what the person eats, or I'm thinking from a social work perspective and viewing from the social determinants of health, we should also consider issues around poverty, people who are subjected to poverty and not being able to afford healthy meals. So I think it's important that we understand some of the contributing factors that might be influencing a person's weight as a Black person, but definitely not from a sort of a genetic perspective, but from the experiences that we feel. And all of this is stemmed from all of that historical consequences of systemic racism that plays into the health and well-being of any individuals of the Black community. So without addressing those issues that people are confronted with, we are certainly not going to get to the bottom of the causation of these issues. And so I think it's important that people understand that this, if a person comes and to the healthcare and the issues around obesity, then think about some of the influences that cause obesity.
Well, thank you so much. I'm wondering, Professor Handel, in your definition around allyship, we acknowledge the imperfection that is associated with being an ally. But a fundamental argument that's made by folks who are making for more racial equity is the notion that we actually need an ally in and of itself is an indicator of systemic racism within our structures. What do we say? Like, how do we move away from the conversation of allyship to a more addressing and fundamentally getting to the root cause of what are the causes of systemic racism, and how do we ensure that we have racial equity in our social settings and in our systems and institutions? You're on mute. Sorry.
I think allyship is important, is crucial, because what you want us to move towards, that I would very much agree to, is an equitable society. How we get there takes the work of everybody, right? So part of what makes allyship work or makes allyship necessary is the idea that it ought not to be left to those who are being oppressed or marginalized to overcome everything on their own, right? It's not that people don't have agency, people have agency, but all the struggles around any form of equity have had to be done with the work of allies helping out. So in other words, I think we should feel an obligation, right? It is not up to women alone to end sexism. It's not up to IB Park people alone to end racism. It's not up to queer folks alone to end homophobia. So in the same way, when we take up something like anti-Black racism, it takes allies. And sometimes it takes allies who are in positions of authority. So people should have, I think we all should have that idea that we want to live in an equitable society. And if we remain tied only to our own identities and we do narrow identity politics, then we're not working towards that better society that we all need to work towards. So it's not just a matter of Black people looking for allies. Black people should also be looking out to see how we can be allied with other people, because the end game is for what you're describing, which is a just and equitable society for all of us.
Great. Thank you so much. I think the comment you made, Aika, about racialized people stereotyping within the anti-Black stereotypics that is present within the racialized communities is oftentimes in my question associated with their own experience of colonialism. If colonialism were to be addressed, would the conversation shift to white supremacy as the primary problem?
Okay. I think it does. I think that when we look at history and we look at a lot of the different countries, all of them, if not, have been colonized by white powers. And within that, they've left those structures that even visible minorities, and even within certain Black countries as well, we continue to perpetuate those types of white supremacies within our systems. And it's really hard for us to sometimes unlearn them. So yes, I would have to agree that it is because of colonialism, and it's a post-colonialism effect. And then, you have to kind of move away from that. And it's through education do we really move away from that. But at the same time, there's a standard of accountability that we need to have within visible minority populations, that we realize that, we're actually perpetuating or reinforcing these structures when we're actually supposed to be dismantling these structures. So yes to that question, in short.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Ivy, you and I had a number of conversations around was with the emergence of the death and unfortunate death of George Floyd, around what it means to be a Black person in today's world. You and I have had extensive conversation also what it means to be a Black professional working for this institution, Fraser Health, and the privilege of working in the healthcare industry in the light of COVID and what's happening. What do you say from your conversations of colleagues and your experiences? What are some of the things you're hearing? And what are the things that we can do as an institution to make sure that Fraser Health and the healthcare system is listening, creating a psychologically safe environment for individuals to come forward and share their own experiences and feel part and parcel of this society and this institution?
Oh, thank you, Matassa. So some of the things I've been hearing, from people who work in Fraser, Black employees, again, is around the experiences of exclusion, being passed over for opportunities. We talk about the microaggression that people experience, so all of this compiled, has create some kind of trauma, some traumatic experience for people, and again, not being able to openly express this in a safe manner. These are some of the challenges that people are facing, and I guess as Inka mentioned earlier, it's about that the perpetuation of these ideas, systemic or the structural barriers that are created from that supremacy, ideology. And so I think people, although we are open and, we seem like we're open to diversity and the language is there, but there's still that practical experience that people need to have in terms of how they view, how they're seen in the organization, whether they're valued for their opinion, or are they excluded from the discussions? Are they included as tokenism as opposed to being a part of the solution? So these are kind of issues that come up quite often, and again, I hear them because people don't feel safe enough to discuss them with the larger, group or leaders of different groups. So I think, a platform of safety for discussion need to be provided for these individuals. In fact, I just learned not too long ago that some employees have quit because of even the current atmosphere of racism that they experience, that their narrative around what they're experiencing, and some of them are very, implicit kind of biases that are challenging to the staff.
Well, thank you so much. I think it's similarly some of the experiences and the conversations I've had with individuals was, while we are striving forward to create a culture where it's psychologically safe to come forward, individuals don't at the front line specifically feel that trickle down to their level where they're feeling adequate, safe enough to come forward and share their experiences. And there is a lot of work and awareness that needs to be done. And this is one of those opportunities where we're here saying, let's talk about it. Let's have these courageous boundary pushing conversations around what it means, because the conversation around anti-racism is often picked as blame and shame that something is wrong, whereas we're looking more for calling in individuals, learning together what the experiences are. Professor Handel, I'm wondering, from your experience, what is something that individuals in leadership and at the policy level could do to ensure that the idea of diversity is one, but the idea of inclusion is another? Like, you can have a diverse workforce, but it's not inclusive enough. In that, I think there was a saying I recently read where diversity is being invited to the party, whereas inclusion is being asked to dance. So how with someone, otherwise you're just going to be a member of the party, not really having a lot of fun. What do you say then to individuals around what it means to be inclusive enough in such a way that where you are creating that equitable society or working towards the creation of that equitable society, specifically for the Black community?
Well, I think both Ika and Ivy have touched on so many different important elements that are relevant to this. So the problem exists not only for those in authority, but those in authority are also part of the problem, and therefore could become a huge part of the problem. In how is it that when people see somebody who is Black, whether as a colleague or as a patient, what is it that they see, right? We're not discussing this explicitly enough. People are working with all kinds of stereotypes in their minds, all kinds of presuppositions, and that exists for people in authority as well. So it's particularly important, I mean, for those in authority, people who shape the way that we see things. One example is from the NHS in England. When all this crisis started, people put up pictures of the NHS, videos of the NHS at work, and people went berserk about those pictures. It was apparently all the nurses were white women in England, which is of course not true. Everybody knows people from the whole former empire are there, right? They're Nigerians, people from the Caribbean, people from India who are doing that work, right? So if you are conceptualizing what the NHS is and what you see is white women helping, right? You have an image in your mind. This is about our societal kind of knee-jerk racism. So those in authority have the obligation, I would say, to be what I would call anti-racist change champions, meaning they have to stand up, they have to set the tone for the organization. They have to have racism and addressing it on the front burner of the kind of work that they do. They ought to be setting the tone, they ought to be addressing the issues, they ought to be supporting this kind of work. A position like yours, for example, right? They ought to be supporting this kind of work. They ought to be opening up channels where people, so if your immediate supervisor maybe is not willing to listen to you, if somebody creates the kind of atmosphere where it's possible for you to authority, as Ivy was saying, how do you feel about talking to your supervisor about something? Do you feel safe? So create the tone and the atmosphere and the culture in which Black people feel welcome, Black people feel valued, and Black people feel included. And not, as you know, as Ivy said, very importantly, not tokenized in that representation. So I think those in authority have a very special responsibility to set tone, to push for a kind of culture, to have these kinds of issues on the front burner, and not to put issues against one another. When people say, for example, we're in a health crisis, we don't have time to deal with race or racism. No, because for some people it is compounded. We're all under a lot of stress because of COVID, and Black people are under even added stress because of COVID. How are you going to respond? Is what's happening to your kid in school? Additional anxieties are compounded for people of color and for indigenous folks when we're going through a crisis. So is the healthcare system taking that into account, and the stereotypes that we have of certain groups and their activities and their ways of getting together? I was just watching the news just before this, and somebody was saying, well, they're starting to blame certain kinds of people in Brampton because of certain cultures without naming cultures, right? So this is a kind of stereotyping of entire communities, and we don't take into account how do people live? What kind of interventions do you need? Do people have access to even doing something like a COVID test, depending on where they are? Those are the kinds of ways of thinking and taking race and racism into account strategically, even as you're doing something like, oh, I'm a manager and I have to deal with issues to do with the COVID. So you're taking those into account at the same time, not separating them out and saying, I don't have time for this right now because I'm doing this over here. They're all imbricated. It's part of how I think those in positions of authority ought to see the work.
Thank you so much. I think the COVID pandemic has shown the health inequities present in our care system, specifically for racialized folks and Black communities, because with this disease, we know chronic disease and other underlying issues are also a factor in how you respond to it. Studies have shown, I think, a number of times where Black people are systemically untreated for pain, and a significant amount of professionals in the medical field held other beliefs about Black people and their experiences of pain. In your work with the sickle cell disease and from a personal experience, can you speak to that, and what does that mean in light of COVID and what's happening, the vulnerability of the racialized communities, the Black community specifically, and this ingrained belief around what the Black people's experiences of pain are?
So I can also speak on that with the sickle cell work as well as my work as for me personally. So I have fibromyalgia, and it took me over 10 years to finally get the final diagnosis when I knew what it was the entire time. And throughout that entire process of having to access the medical healthcare system and actually getting to a point where I had to self-diagnose and actually take matters into my own hands, I guess with patients, especially Black patients, there's, I guess the most common thing that you'll hear from them is silence. They're being silenced, they're being dehumanized, and they're being ignored. And it's all associated to stigma and this implicit bias that, you know, when we come into certain places, when we come into these healthcare services or settings, that we're literally just here as a body, and that we don't have the opportunity in terms of agency and autonomy to make decisions and to be part of these decision-making processes in terms of ways in which we want to be treated or even being heard in terms of our diagnosis and the things that that we're experiencing with our pain or with whatever illness or that we're having. And specific to my experience, before I go into sickle cell, I had to go through a battle where I'm explaining to the physicians that these are my pain symptoms. This is what I'm experiencing when I go into emergency care settings for pain relief. I'm constantly having to prove to them that I am a patient and I actually have a problem and I'm not just there for drugs. And that is also a very common thing with sickle cell as well, as patients are going through crises, is having to explain themselves constantly. And through my work with sickle cell disease over the course of since 2014, I've come to understand the ways in physicians are limited in terms of trying to treat patients with just giving them drugs, even though they come in. I understand there's a liability issue. However, there is also an issue in terms of the dehumanization of Black individuals when they go into the hospitals and they talk to them. They're being ignored. There's also a power differential too. So I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of communication and education, and understanding these diseases, especially the ones that primarily affect Black populations. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, especially towards sickle cell disease, to think that it's a Black disease. This is something that when sickle cell first came out, I was just reading a paper that it was considered a Black disease in the early 1900s. But as we shift more, we realize that a lot of people within different races, especially those that are primarily affected by malaria, have this genetic mutation where you have sickle cell disease. And through understanding that, when you have a brain crisis, you need some type of relief within 30 minutes of being in an emergency care setting. You need that. And for physicians and healthcare professionals to not understand that and not give patients the ability to have some type of power and to disempower them in these cases, in these settings, is it's something that is a problem that we need to discuss. And I think that also stretches in terms of my experiences with fibromyalgia, where I felt disempowered. I felt like, I have something, I'm trying to explain this to you, and you're ignoring me. And it's until, I start bringing up the fact, well, hey, you know what? I'm well-educated. I am worked in the healthcare setting. I'm a master's, I have to be honestly proving myself worthy to be listened to. And no Black patient should ever have to have that, because a lot of us within our communities are not, like, health education and health literacy is limited. Not everyone's going to have someone like me in the hospital room to advocate for them. But this is why people like myself and those that I work around do that stuff. But again, in short, we do have a big problem, and where patients are feeling silenced, ignored, dehumanized, and devalued and disempowered. So it is a very big issue that we need to talk about.
Thank you, Eka, for sharing that. I appreciate it. Ivy, as a healthcare provider yourself, how do we then empower patients and systems to create that safe space for advocating for patients? As a social worker, I'm going to assume, especially for your colleagues in an acute care setting, at the discharge table, they may have disagreements with the clinical team. And oftentimes that may create a bit of a challenge. So how do you advocate for individuals who are vulnerable in their settings?
Yeah, that is certainly a good question, Mustafa, and it's something that we encounter on a regular basis. I really appreciate Eka bringing this forward, because I often hear from individuals, Black individuals who come to the healthcare system, sometimes surprised that they're being treated respectfully or with any kind of dignity. And that's all, that to me should not be a part of people's everyday experience. But it does happen that people come into the system and they feel devalued and dignity stripped, and definitely perceived as seekers of, drugs as opposed to health care. And so my recommendation to people that come to me with these challenges is always around helping them to kind of, develop some personal advocacy, like Eka had mentioned about, expressing themselves in a way that they feel confident about standing up for themselves and expressing what they're experiencing to the healthcare providers. I know that sometimes it's really difficult for people, for example, in the older Black community, who were so subjected to a lot of this discrimination for a long time, when they come into the system, they're definitely they're more submissive as opposed to being advocates for themselves. So that is something I always try to. One of the recommendations that I give to people when I hear their concern is to use the forum of patient quality services, especially with Fraser Health, write to Fraser Health and just say, express their experience, tell them about their experience. So that's one avenue. The other thing that I always do is try to educate people about the healthcare system, how it works, and also let them also, know about this disparity, even though they're experiencing it, sometimes they're, it's so difficult to understand what's really going on. So to educate people around this experience and how they can actually advocate for themselves, because, and the other thing that comes to my attention too is that when people try to express themselves, very often they're seen as aggressive. And that plays into that bias again, about that stereotype about the aggressive Black person. So you find a lot of people, they abstain from any kind of advocacy for, fear of being perceived as aggressive. And you have the other end where you have people become so frustrated that they become aggressive, that they become really, that's the only way of advocating for themselves. And then, they're seen as violent or whatever it is. So it does tie into all of those stereotypes and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So all of those things, I think it's something that healthcare try to do individual education to my colleagues as well. Anyone, any opportunity I get to kind of speak on behalf of people and their experiences, that's what I do, to leadership or in any way possible.
Thank you, Ivy. Do you have anything to add, Ika? Well, I can go ahead. If not, no, don't feel pressured. Professor Handel, I think you in your acronym, the DEF, the first one was denial. You did mention around denying the existence of something. And I'm reminded of some conversations I had with individuals who would say, well, I don't see color, specifically in light of the Black Lives Movement. Or someone will just say, well, all lives matter, we're all human beings. How do you respond to comments like that?
Well, yeah, and you might deal with that in the healthcare field. We'll deal with a lot of that in the education field, because a lot of people want to show that the idea of not seeing color is supposed to mean that one is not racist. It's supposed to be an indication that one is not racist. So if you don't see color, that means you treat everybody the same, right? And of course, that's really a fallacy. You should see color, you do see color, you're denying that you see color. So to deny that you see color means that you are denying the possibility of the problem of engaging with racial difference, let alone with the problem of racism. So denial of seeing color means a denial of racial makeup. When people are saying this, that means usually they're trying to put themselves above or beyond race. Some people are even saying we live in a post-racial world, right? A world where race doesn't matter anymore. And of course, that simply is not true. Race keeps coming back. Race is not a real thing, but it's something that has been actively promoted and actually has an effect. So race is not real, but racism is real. So if you're not dealing with race, you're not dealing with the real problem of racism. So not seeing is a way of abdicating the responsibility of addressing racial difference. It's also sometimes to avoid the discomfort. So I only see you as you. I only see individuals. Well, individuals are part of groups. They come with cultures, they come with genders, we come with all those things, right? So we should be in a position where it is possible for us to deal with difference rather than avoid difference, rather than avoid diversity. So that's the problem. It's not that we shouldn't see those differences at all. It's how we take them up, whether we feel comfortable addressing race at all, how we know about other cultures. We should be able to engage rather than deny racial difference. That's all you're doing when you say, I don't see. You're claiming a kind of superiority, but you're in fact denying the problem and failing to address differences. We ought to be able to address differences.
Beautiful. Have something to add, anyone?
I just wanted to add on to that. Like when you don't, as someone said, that if you don't see color, you don't see patterns. And if you don't see patterns, then you won't know what's wrong. And that's the only time that we can actually make those identifications that these are the problems within our societies and to work on solutions. So, but everything was well put. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, Aika, I'm just wondering, I think you did mention around the structures inherently present within systems and the need for accountability. We've noticed earlier on in June, late June, May, a number of big organizations, corporations, including our government, started issuing statements of alliance. And oftentimes there's this notion that if not followed by implementation and resources to implement to address systemic racism, becomes in the category of performance allyship. Right? What do we say then to how do we make sure we move away from just conversations of performative allyship to actual allyship and putting in resources behind the wanting to be an anti-racist and a systemically anti-racist organizations?
Yeah, no, I guess that was one of my biggest frustrations throughout this entire Black Lives Matter coming up with the George Floyd cases, etc., was this performative nature that you needed to put a Black Lives Matter statement out, you needed to put a logo out, you needed to do stuff, and then you had companies who were doing it inappropriately, which just showed that there is an actual issue, that it is all performative. This is more than just saying Black Lives Matter. This is actually a problem, and the only way that you can actually effectively doing that is by taking accountability. And I know I keep saying the word accountability, but what does that mean? That means that you sit down and you actually look at the ways in which your company or your organization is not fulfilling its need for equity. What does equity mean? Equity and equality are two different things. It means two different things. Equality means everybody gets the same share of everything. Equity means that you're actually giving support where support is needed, and you're doing it in a very equitable way, and fair and just way. So that can mean through training programs. There is developing out strategies, anti-racism and anti-Black racism strategies that are effective. You train your employees or your staff in order to understand what that means. There's a lot of people who don't understand what that means. So I thank you, Professor Handel, for actually explaining that to people, because they don't understand the definition of what racism is, or anti-racism and anti-Blackness is. It's about integrating other people within your organization as well. But I think primarily education is needed and training is needed in order to know the ways in which we can actually be equitable within our structures, and understand that giving people the opportunity to amplify their voices, especially Black people in these spaces. There's a lot of us that want to speak about these things. There's a lot of us that don't. So there's other ways of being able to speak and to be an inclusion leader within whatever space you are. It could be the simplest position you have. It could be the smallest position. You may not be in a leadership position, but you have the opportunity to do that within your spaces. And that's just simply speaking to a coworker. I guess that's the only way those are my ways in which I would recommend companies moving forward in terms of being more equitable within these spaces, and not just putting a logo or Black Lives Matter statement, which is just a bunch of words that are meaningless, because then you look into it and it's just like, okay, but you guys are still doing the same thing you guys were doing beforehand. So what are the changes? and ask those questions. Put them on the spot. Put these leaders on spot. They need to be questioned.
Great. Thank you. Professor Handel, when you defined anti-Blackness, you gave a broader definition, and then I could sort of introduce the concept of colorism, shadism. Recently, there was a student from St. George's who discovered that the symptoms that we sometimes have for diseases are based on white skins and not on black skin. How do we then shift that in the education space, specifically the medical education? I know you're an educator. How do we make sure that that's included and inculcated in curriculums? Because then if we're producing a bunch of medical and nursing and all these healthcare professionals whose symptoms and diagnostic are based on the white spectrum, then what happens to the rest of us who don't fall in that shape?
Well, obviously, that is such, you're talking about it at the most fundamental level, right? So that is such an obvious thing, and it's such a long-lasting issue and problem, where a lot of medical medicine and medical research has been geared towards answering questions about what happens with Black bodies, or with white bodies and white minds. And then other bodies, other minds have been pathologized, right? So we have this dichotomy. So some people have said, if it was white people getting things like malaria, they would have found a cure long ago, because this is where the money goes. It's what kind of disease white people are suffering from, right? But for me, I am much more sociological in my thinking. And part of what Aika had brought up is some of what I think we need to talk about, which is not just this dichotomy between whiteness and people of color, or in this case, white and Black, but also the differences, the nuances, even when you want to talk about white folks, some of the differences between different people, and the mixtures. We don't talk about folks that have several racial identities in them. Lots of people in the Caribbean have a little bit of this and a little bit of that in them. So that a lot of that is beginning to, that should be a wake-up call to people to say, this should not be about exclusive white medicine, and hopefully it works for the rest of the world, but really medicine should be taking into account all those kinds of differences. Even within Blackness itself, cultures, ways of life, ways of being. You and I, when we were introducing each other, I immediately said, well, you look kind of East African to me. Even on the continent, somebody from West Africa, I could hardly relate to the diet at all when I went to South Africa. Huge differences. So I think Aika touched on this a little bit. All those kinds of things, people need to be educated about all the kinds of differences, even the richness and diversity of Blackness itself ought to be coming up in how we want to do healthcare in general. And I don't want to limit it to just medicine and medical research, but we have to have that comprehensive, open way of thinking about people and their bodies and their minds and their cultures and the intersections, complex intersections of cultures in the way that we deal with different people, and have an openness to all that richness, rather than having these neat little boxes, the white box being the one that matters the most, and hopefully it works. And I hope I've given a broad enough idea of how complicated things are, that you don't try to apply that and say, hopefully it works for the rest of the world.
Thank you, really appreciate it. Ivy, a question for you. Do you have any ideas for creating a platform of sorts for Fraser Health staff to come together to work towards good allyship?
Mm-hmm. That is a $1 million question, Matassa. I have to say, even for this platform, I do appreciate it, and I'm really encouraged by the fact that we have created this platform in Fraser Health, where we can actually come and have a discussion and have people, listen, and as a group, maybe, the ultimate goal is to learn from this and develop strategies that we can actually implement to make changes moving forward. But I think though, what we need as well is not just this platform, but we also need something where leadership can actually meet with frontline workers, for example. To have those frontline workers, physicians, a diverse team can come together and develop strategies. You have those discussions and develop strategies for some actions. It's good enough to have these discussions, as we mentioned earlier, but where does it go after this? It's about what are the practical things that we can actually put in place to create more equity for everyone, to be more inclusive for everyone. So I think a place to start is having that discussion, that platform where everyone can come together and strategize around how to move forward.
Thank you so much, all of you. I have 4 minutes remaining, and I'm going to give a minute to each one. If you have any tips or things you want to offer to participants on how they can practice anti-racism, be imperfect allies, and be mindful of anti-Blackness. Anyone? I know we've said a lot. We're also recording this session, so we'll take we'll put it up on a link and share it with all participants.
I think I would just hitch my wagon a little bit to what Ivy just said, which I think is so important. I looked at this initiative, for example, and I thought this is wonderful, but it links back to what Ika said, which is where is the accountability? So in other words, how do we move beyond statements? All the universities, for example, have put out statements, right? Different universities have followed up in different ways and to different extents. How does Fraser Health and all of us take up these kinds of issues in a very real way? What do you put behind it? What resources? What actual changes? How do you change policy? How do you change leadership? I think data is so important. What is the data that is out there on representation of Blackness in terms of the public, in terms of employees, in terms of being in leadership positions, in terms of mentorship to get people into leadership positions? I think all of those ought to be taken up by what your own experts here, Ika and Ivy, from me listening to them. I would say those things need to be taken up very much so in the system.
Thank you, Dr. Handel. Ika?
I guess my takeaway is there's a difference between passive empathy and active empathy. I feel like a lot of the empathy that the Black community has been receiving through Black Lives Matter is very passive. You can understand our struggles, you can see the pain we're suffering. Well, a lot of people can, but it's about the action and what you plan on doing in order to mitigating, dismantling these structures that affect us, and being perfect allies. If you can be a perfect ally by making people accountable and talking about it. If someone says something or has a stigmatized or stereotype about someone and it's untrue, speak up. It's okay to speak up. There was a conversation that I was listening to, and someone says that there's a lot of times we're gonna have to shake off a lot of people who are not educated or are just holding back in terms of being active, in terms of being advocates for visible minorities and Black populations as well. And sometimes we have to be the ones to educate other people. And it's okay to ask questions, but please ask them in the most respectful way possible. Ask questions the way you would want to be asked these questions.
Thank you. I have 30 seconds for you, Ivy, before this closes.
Well, again, thanks, Mutasa. I think one of my things, and just maybe a recommendation that I have is about dare to imagine. Imagine a place or community or workplace where we can actually feel we don't have to ask anymore or be surprised anymore when we see a Black person in leadership. And think about what really contributes to that perception.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful spending the hour with you. I've learned a lot, and there were so many messages that I've come across. We'll collate it. For folks who have joined us, thank you so much for taking the time. We have a number of online education resources through the Ethics and Diversity Services. Please go to our Pulse page on the intranet and explore. If you have questions, send it to diversity.services@Fraser Health. Just a reminder to please fill out the quick 3-question survey that you'll receive a link for when you close the window. Your feedback is important to shape our discourse and make Fraser Health, our healthcare system, culturally safe and diversity competent. Thank you all.